At our son's new house party, my wife whispered, "We have to go." What she said next left me completely frozen. If you have ever had someone mistake your kindness for weakness, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the rest of my story, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. It means the world to me. My name is Edward Collins. I am 72 years old, and for the last 4 decades I built a commercial real estate and logistics business from the ground up, right here in Ohio. I did not inherit a single dime. I started with a used pickup truck, a folding table, and a handshake, and I built something that fed my family for 3 generations. But none of that mattered on the night my daughter-in-law tore my wife's dignity away in front of 300 people. None of that mattered until the moment I stood in that ballroom and handed her an envelope that was never a gift. It was a verdict. But let me back up. Let me tell you exactly how this nightmare began. Because to understand why I reacted the way I did, you have to understand the 46 years that came before it. I grew up the second of 5 children on a farm outside of Dayton. My father worked himself into an early grave before I turned 19, and I learned very quickly that nobody was going to hand me anything I did not build with my own 2 hands. I drove a delivery truck for a produce company for 6 years, saving every spare dollar in a coffee can hidden behind the water heater in the apartment I rented above a hardware store. When I was 26, I met Margaret at a diner outside of Columbus. She was waiting tables to pay her way through nursing school, and I noticed her before she ever noticed me. The way she talked to every single customer like they mattered, even the rude ones, even the ones who left no tip at all. I asked her out 3 times before she said yes. On our first real date, I took her to the same diner where she worked, because it was the only place I could afford, and she laughed so hard at that she nearly fell out of the booth. She ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, a bowl of soup and a roll, because she said she could tell by my face I was doing math in my head about the bill, and she did not want me to feel small. That is who Margaret has always been. She has spent her entire life thinking about everyone else before she thinks about herself. We married 2 years later in her parents' backyard, 40 guests, a borrowed suit, and a cake her mother baked herself. I promised her that night that one day I would build her a life where she never had to worry about a grocery bill again, and for 46 years, I kept every single promise I ever made to that woman, except the one I am about to tell you I almost failed to keep. We had Daniel 11 years into our marriage, after 2 miscarriages that nearly broke Margaret's spirit entirely. When he was finally born healthy, I remember standing in that hospital hallway and swearing to myself that this boy would never know one single day of the hunger or fear I grew up with. I built my logistics company, Collins Freight and Holdings, from a single leased delivery truck into a regional operation with 14 warehouses and a fleet of over 200 vehicles. I worked 18-hour days for the first decade. I missed birthdays. I missed a Christmas or 2. Margaret never once complained, because she understood what we were building, and she raised Daniel almost entirely on her own during those years, teaching him, she thought, the same values that had carried us out of poverty. Looking back now, I think I made a mistake somewhere in there. I gave Daniel everything I never had, and somewhere along the way, I forgot to also give him the thing that actually mattered, which was the memory of not having it. He grew up in a 5-bedroom house with a pool. He drove a car I bought him the day he turned 16. He went to a private university. I paid for in full. No loans, no work study, no understanding of what it cost. I told myself I was giving him a head start. I did not realize I was giving him a blindfold. Margaret and I retired quietly 6 years ago, once Daniel was fully grown, and we believed, fully capable of standing on his own. We settled into a peaceful rhythm, gardening, church on Sundays, dinner with old friends. Margaret took up watercolor painting. I finally learned to slow down enough to sit still with her on the porch in the evenings. It was, for a long time, the happiest stretch of our entire lives together. Then, 14 months ago, Margaret found a lump during a routine self-exam, and everything we had built our quiet retirement around was suddenly reduced to a single word neither of us wanted to say out loud. Cancer. Stage 2 at first diagnosis. Which felt survivable, which felt like something we could fight and win. We fought it together, every single appointment, every single needle, every single sleepless night, when the nausea kept her curled over the toilet at 3 in the morning, while I held her hair back and told her we would get through this, the same way we got through everything else. Together. quietly, without complaint. It was 6 days after her oncologist told us the cancer had spread to her lymph nodes, upgrading her to stage 3, that I made the decision about the house. Let me tell you exactly how that decision unfolded. Because every detail of what came next traces directly back to that one gray Tuesday morning. It was a gray Tuesday morning in early spring. I remember the exact date because it was 6 days after my wife Margaret's oncologist told us the cancer had spread to her lymph nodes. Margaret is 69 years old. She has been the center of my universe for 46 years. We met at a diner outside of Columbus when I was 26 and broke, and she still ordered the cheapest thing on the menu just so I would not feel bad about my empty wallet. That is who Margaret is. She has spent her entire life thinking about everyone else before herself. When the doctor told us the treatment would require weekly trips downtown, 3 hours each way in traffic from our house in the suburbs, I made a decision on the spot. We needed a smaller place close to the medical center, something with no stairs, close to the hospital, close to good air, close to comfort. I had the money. 40 years of hard work meant I had the money sitting right there, liquid, ready to spend on the one thing that actually mattered. I told my son Daniel about it over dinner that same week. Daniel is 34. He has my jawline and his mother's eyes, and for most of his life, I believed he had my work ethic too. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, nodding along seriously, and said, "Dad, let me handle this. I know a realtor downtown, I know the market. I can close this fast, so Mom doesn't have to keep making that drive. You and Mom have enough on your plate. Let your son carry something for once." I remember how proud that made me feel. I remember thinking, finally, my son is stepping up. 40 years of teaching him responsibility, and here it was, blooming right in front of me at my own kitchen table. I wired him $840,000. That was the number the realtor he mentioned had quoted for a modest single-story home, 8 minutes from the hospital. I did not ask for paperwork right away because I trusted him. That is the mistake fathers make. We confuse blood with character. We assume the boy we raised is the man standing in front of us. 3 days passed. Daniel sent me photos of a home he claimed was in escrow. Beautiful ranch house, single level, wide doorways for a wheelchair if it ever came to that. A covered porch where Margaret could sit in the sun. I showed the pictures to Margaret and she cried. The good kind of crying. And for the first time since her diagnosis, I saw something like hope on her face. 6 days after I wired the money, I went to my bank to check on something unrelated. A business transfer for one of my rental properties. My banker, a woman named Carol who has handled my accounts for 11 years, pulled up my transaction history to confirm a wire, and she paused. She squinted at the screen and said, "Mr. Collins, this $840,000 wire from last week, this went to Meridian Yacht Brokerage. Is that correct?" I remember the silence in that bank lobby. I remember the hum of the air conditioning, the smell of stale coffee from the little station by the door, and the sound of my own heartbeat suddenly very loud in my ears. I asked her to repeat it. She did. Meridian Yacht Brokerage. Not a title company. Not an escrow account. A yacht dealership 2 hours south of us, on the lake. I did not yell in that bank lobby. I have spent 40 years in boardrooms learning that the man who raises his voice first has already lost the negotiation. I simply asked Carol to print the wire confirmation and thanked her for her time. I walked to my truck, sat behind the wheel, and stared through the windshield for 11 minutes without turning the key. That night I opened Instagram, something I rarely do, because my granddaughter had insisted I make an account to see her volleyball photos. I typed in Daniel's fiance's name, Sophia Reyes. Her page was public, and there it was, posted 4 days earlier. A photograph of Sophia in a white sundress, champagne glass in hand, standing on the bow of a brand new 42-foot luxury yacht. The lake behind her glowing orange in the sunset. The caption read, "Manifesting the life we deserve. Bless doesn't even cover it." I sat in my recliner and read that caption 7 times. The life we deserve. My wife was sitting in a chemotherapy chair getting poison dripped into her veins to save her life. And $840,000 of the house she had prayed for was floating on a lake underneath a woman drinking champagne. I called Daniel the next morning. I kept my voice level. I have negotiated $100 million shipping contracts without raising my voice. and I was not going to let this be the conversation that broke that streak. "Daniel," I said, "I need to ask you about the wire I sent you last week." There was a pause on the line, then a sigh. The kind of sigh a teenager gives you when you catch them sneaking in past curfew, not the kind of sigh a grown man gives his father. "Dad, look. It's not what it looks like," he said. "It's a temporary thing. Sophia found an incredible deal on a boat. Resale value is insane in this market. We're going to flip it in 3 months and put every dollar right back into the house fund, probably with extra. I just needed the cash to move fast before someone else grabbed it. I was going to tell you." "You were going to tell me," I repeated. "Dad, I've got this handled. I promise you, by the time Mom needs to move in, the house will be paid for in full. Cash. No mortgage." I just made a smart play with the timing. I did not scream at my son. I sat very quietly at my kitchen table, in the same chair I had sat in when I told him I would help him, and I said, "Your mother has stage 3 cancer, Daniel. She does not have 3 months for you to gamble with her house money on a boat." "It's not gambling, Dad. It's an investment," he snapped. "You've never trusted me with anything real in my whole life. This is me finally doing something big, and you can't even give me one chance." He hung up on me. My own son hung up the phone on me while his mother sat in an infusion chair 40 minutes away with a needle in her arm. I did not call back. I have learned in business that when someone is lying to you, calling repeatedly only teaches them how to lie better. So instead, I did what I have always done when something threatened my family. I started watching, quietly, patiently, the way I used to watch competitors before I made a move that would end their business for good. Before I tell you about the tea, I need to tell you about something else that happened during those same weeks, because it shaped how carefully I moved through everything that followed. Word travels fast in small business circles, and somehow, despite my best efforts to keep the yacht situation quiet, a rumor began circulating among some of my old industry contacts that Edward Collins was having family trouble and might be looking to liquidate assets quickly. I do not know exactly how that rumor started. I have my suspicions it traced back to a loose comment Daniel made at a golf outing, bragging in a way that revealed more than he intended. The way men do when they are trying to sound important in front of people they want to impress. Whatever the source, it reached a man named Charles Bettman, a competitor who had tried and failed twice over the years to acquire pieces of my logistics operation at below market value. Charles called me on a Sunday afternoon, his voice dripping with false sympathy, asking if everything was all right, mentioning he had heard some things and wanted to see if I might be interested in a quick, friendly sale of my downtown commercial properties. The very properties Daniel had already fraudulently pledged as collateral without my knowledge. I remember sitting in my study with that phone pressed to my ear, understanding in an instant that Charles had no idea just how close he was standing to the edge of a legal disaster. If I had sold those properties to him in the state they were secretly in, encumbered by a forged $2.3 million lien Daniel had placed against them, it would have collapsed the entire structure Gerald and I were quietly building, exposed the fraud prematurely, and possibly let both Daniel and Sophia liquidate what remained of the yacht money and disappear before any charges could be filed. I told Charles politely that everything was fine, that I had no interest in selling, and that I appreciated his concern. He pushed twice more over the following weeks, each time a little more transparent about his opportunism, at one point even mentioning he had heard some paperwork issues with my properties, which told me Daniel's forged loan documents may have already begun circulating in ways I had not anticipated, likely through the bank's normal underwriting inquiries. That call lit a fire under Gerald and me to move faster than we had originally planned. We accelerated the loan acquisition timeline by nearly a week, working through 2 consecutive weekends to make sure I held that debt firmly in my own hands, before anyone else could interfere with what Daniel and Sophia had unknowingly handed me. I never told Daniel about Charles Bettman's calls. I never told Sophia. It remained, until this moment telling you this story, a piece of the puzzle known only to Gerald, Priya, and me. But I share it now because it illustrates something important about those months. I was not only protecting Margaret from a slow poisoning, and protecting my estate from fraud, I was also, quietly, protecting the entire foundation of everything I built for 40 years, from opportunists, circling from every direction, the moment they smelled weakness in an old man's family. That is a lesson I learned early in business, and relearned late in life. Vultures do not care whose blood is on the ground. They only care that blood is there at all. 2 weeks later, Sophia started coming around more. She began showing up at our house with little glass jars of what she called healing tea, a blend of dried herbs she said her grandmother in Ecuador had taught her to make. She would sit beside Margaret on the couch, brewing the tea herself in our kitchen, refusing to let anyone else touch it, insisting it was just for Margaret, made with so much love. In front of Daniel, in front of anyone who would listen, she painted herself as the devoted daughter-in-law, the one sacrificing her Saturdays to care for a sick woman she barely knew a year ago. "I just want to help however I can," she told our neighbor Linda one afternoon on our porch, dabbing at a dry eye with a tissue. "Margaret means so much to me. I consider her my own mother now." Margaret, exhausted from chemo and desperate for kindness anywhere she could find it, drank that tea every single day. 2 cups, sometimes 3. And within 3 weeks, something strange started happening. Margaret's numbers, the ones her oncologist had been cautiously optimistic about, began sliding backward. Her white blood cell counts dropped. Her fatigue tripled. Her doctor looked confused during our appointment, flipping through her chart, asking if she had missed any doses of her medication. "No," Margaret told him. "I haven't missed a single dose. I've actually been taking extra care of myself. My daughter-in-law makes me tea every day." I watched the doctor's face when she said that. He did not say anything alarming in the room, but something in his expression stayed with me the entire drive home. That night, while Margaret slept, I went into the kitchen and found the jar Sophia had left behind, half full of dried leaves and roots I did not recognize. I took a small sample, sealed it in a plastic bag, and the next morning I drove it myself to an independent toxicology lab 2 counties over, one that had done contamination testing for my logistics company years earlier. I told them I wanted a full compound analysis, no rush, but thorough. 6 days later, the lab called. The man on the phone, a chemist named Dr. Whitfield, sounded careful with his words. The way professionals sound when they know what they are about to say will detonate something. "Mr. Collins, this blend contains several compounds that are known to interact negatively with chemotherapy drugs, specifically ones that inhibit the metabolic pathway your wife's treatment relies on. In plain terms, this tea isn't healing anything. It's actively working against her medication. Whoever is making this either doesn't understand basic pharmacology, or they know exactly what they're doing." I sat in my truck in that lab's parking lot for a long time after that call ended. I remember driving home from that lab that afternoon, with the windows down despite the cold, needing the air on my face to keep from being sick. I thought about every cup of that tea Margaret had drunk with such gratitude, thanking Sophia each time, telling her how much better it made her feel, how thoughtful it was, how lucky Daniel was to have found someone so caring. I thought about the 7 weeks Margaret had spent quietly, unknowingly, drinking something actively working to undo months of treatment, months of needles, months of her own body fighting to survive. I pulled my truck over on the shoulder of the highway for nearly 20 minutes, my hands gripping the wheel, before I trusted myself to drive the rest of the way home. I did not confront Sophia. I did not confront Daniel. I have spent 40 years learning that the moment you show your hand, you lose the game. Instead, I decided I needed to know everything, not just about the tea. Everything. I started paying closer attention when Sophia and Daniel visited. I noticed she always kept a second phone in her purse, a cheap prepaid one with a cracked corner, and a faded blue case, separate from the sleek, expensive smartphone she used constantly for her social media posts. She was careful with it, I noticed, always keeping her purse within arm's reach, always angling her body slightly when she checked it, small habits that would mean nothing to most people, but meant everything to a man who spent 40 years learning to notice when an employee was hiding something during an internal audit. One evening in late spring, Daniel and Sophia came over for dinner to discuss wedding vendor invoices, spreading contracts and swatches across our dining room table, while Margaret rested upstairs, worn out from a treatment session earlier that day. Around 8 o'clock, an argument broke out between them over a florist deposit, voices rising just enough that they decided to step out onto the back patio to continue it privately, leaving their phones, jackets, and paperwork scattered across the table. I walked into the kitchen to refill my water glass, and there it was, sitting on the counter beside the sink where Sophia had set her purse down earlier. The screen was unlocked, still glowing faintly from her last use, A small oversight born from the kind of confidence people carry when they believe they have already gotten away with something. Through the window above the sink, I could see Daniel and Sophia's silhouettes on the patio, backlit by the porch light, still gesturing at each other about flowers and money. I stood there for a long moment with that phone in my hand, my own heart hammering against my ribs, fully aware of exactly what I was about to do, and exactly what it would mean if I found nothing at all. If this was simply an old phone she used for some unrelated reason, and I had let my grief and suspicion turn me into the kind of man who spies on his own family for no reason. But some instinct, some old instinct I trusted from decades of reading people across a negotiating table, told me this was not nothing. I am not proud of what I did next, but I am not ashamed of it either. I opened her messages. What I found took the air out of my lungs. There was a thread with Daniel, dated back nearly 2 months, that made my blood run cold. Sophia had written, "The tea is working. Her numbers are down again. Doctors confused. This is good for us. The sooner this plays out, the sooner we get the house and the estate." Daniel had responded with a single laughing emoji and the words, "Just don't overdo it. We don't need questions. Slow and steady, babe." I photographed every message with my own phone, my hands trembling so badly I had to retake several of the pictures. Then I found something even worse, further down the thread. A voice memo, 17 seconds long. I put in my earbuds and played it in the dark of my own kitchen, my wife asleep upstairs, dying by degrees because of what these two people were pouring into her cup every single day. It was Sophia's voice. "Once she's gone, Daniel gets everything automatically. No will contest possible if it's already inherited property, and your dad is too soft to fight us in court over his dead wife's estate. We just need patience." Her voice. Calm, businesslike. Discussing my wife's death like a quarterly earnings projection. I put the phone back exactly where I found it, screen locked, angle unchanged, and I walked out to my garage and sat in the dark for 2 hours. I did not cry. I did not shake anymore. Something in me had gone very still, the same stillness I remember from the week I fought off a hostile takeover of my own company 20 years ago. That stillness is not the absence of rage. It is rage that has decided to become useful instead of loud. The next morning I called my attorney, a sharp, quiet man named Gerald Voss, who has handled every major transaction of my career for the last 22 years. I told him everything. The wire, the yacht, the tea, the lab results, the messages, the voice memo. Gerald did not speak for a long moment after I finished. "Edward," he finally said, "we are going to need to move very carefully, and very legally. What you found on that phone without her consent may not be admissible on its own, but it tells us exactly where to look, and that is worth more than any evidence in the world." In the days after I found that voice memo, I found myself watching my own son the way I used to watch a warehouse manager I suspected of skimming inventory, cataloging every small tell, every inconsistency, every moment his story did not quite line up with the version he had told me the week before. It is a strange and terrible thing to study your own child like a suspect. I remember standing at my kitchen sink one morning, washing a coffee mug, watching Daniel through the window as he unloaded grocery bags from his car for a visit, laughing at something on his phone, completely unaware that his father now knew what he and his fiancée were planning for his own mother. I remember thinking, this is the boy I taught to ride a bicycle in the church parking lot. This is the boy who cried at his grandfather's funeral and asked me if Grandpa would be cold in the ground. Somewhere between that boy and this man, something had rotted, and I did not yet understand how deep the rot went. I decided I needed more than a single voice memo and a handful of text messages, because I knew, even in my anger, that anger built on incomplete evidence collapses the first time someone competent pushes back on it. I needed the whole structure, top to bottom, before I moved a single inch. The first thing I did was quietly request my own credit report and a full asset ledger from my accountant, a meticulous woman named Priya Anand, who has managed my books for 15 years. I wanted to know exactly what Daniel had access to, on paper, that I might have forgotten about over the years. Priya called me back within 2 days, her voice tight with concern. "Edward," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to stay calm while I ask it. Did you authorize a signature update on the collateral file for your 3 downtown commercial properties? Because someone submitted refreshed guarantor paperwork to First Ridgeline Bank 6 weeks ago, and the signature on it does not match the signature card we have on file from you. That was the first piece of the larger puzzle. I told her no, absolutely not, and asked her to pull every document connected to that loan file immediately. What she sent me over secure email that same afternoon made my hands shake as I read it at my own desk. My name, forged with startling accuracy, across a personal guarantee for a $2.3 million business credit facility, using my 3 downtown rental properties as collateral. The loan had been drawn down in 5 separate disbursements over 4 months, each one landing in an account held jointly by Daniel Collins and Sophia Reyes. I sat with that information for 2 full days before I told Gerald anything, because I needed to be certain in my own mind that I was not seeing a coincidence, not seeing a paperwork error, not seeing anything other than exactly what it appeared to be. I drove downtown to the bank branch myself and asked, under the pretense of reviewing my own portfolio, to see the original wet ink signature page. The bank manager, a polite young man who clearly had no idea what he was about to hand a grieving father, printed it for me without hesitation. I have signed my name more than 100,000 times across 4 decades of contracts, leases, and loan documents. I know exactly how my own hand moves across a page. The slight hook on the final D in Collins. The way I always underline my own signature out of an old habit from my father, who taught me that an unmarked signature was an invitation for someone to add a line above it. This forged signature had no underline. Whoever had practiced it, likely Daniel, had gotten close enough to fool a bank clerk processing hundreds of documents a week, but not close enough to fool the man whose name it was supposed to be. I brought the printed page to Gerald's office that same afternoon, along with the toxicology report Dr. Whitfield had sent 2 weeks earlier, along with the photographs I had taken of the messages on Sophia's second phone, along with a printed copy of her Instagram post standing on the bow of that yacht. I laid it all out on his conference table like pieces of a puzzle I had been too afraid to look at directly, until that moment. Gerald is not a man who shows much on his face. In 22 years of working with him, I have watched him deliver devastating news to me twice. Once when a business partner tried to embezzle from our joint venture, once when my own brother sued me over our late mother's estate, and both times his expression never changed. This time, reading through the forged signature page, his jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough that I noticed. "Edward," he said, setting the page down carefully, "I want you to understand what we are looking at here. This is not a family dispute anymore. This is federal bank fraud, forgery, and depending on what that lab report actually proves, in a court of law, this may also be attempted poisoning of a vulnerable adult. I need you to think very carefully about whether you want this handled quietly, within the family, or whether you want this handled the way the law is designed to handle it." I told him I wanted both. I wanted my wife protected first, immediately, completely, and I wanted my son and his fiancée to face exactly what the law said they should face, without a single ounce of mercy carved out for the fact that one of them happened to share my last name. Over the following weeks, Gerald and I built the case with surgical precision. First, we pulled the financial records on the yacht purchase, confirming the $840,000 had gone directly through Meridian Yacht Brokerage into an account jointly held by Daniel and Sophia. Second, and this was the discovery that truly stunned me, Gerald's forensic accountant uncovered that Daniel had forged my signature on collateral documents for 3 of my commercial rental properties downtown, properties still legally in my name, using them to secure a $2.3 million business loan from a regional bank. The loan had been drawn down entirely in cash over the previous 4 months, funneled into accounts controlled by Sophia, some of it already spent on the boat, on designer handbags, on a deposit for a lakefront property neither of them could otherwise afford. My own son had forged my name on federal banking documents to steal against my life's work, while his fiancée slowly poisoned my dying wife's tea to speed up an inheritance that had not even been offered to them yet. "Here is what we are going to do," Gerald told me over a quiet dinner at his office. "We are going to quietly purchase that $2.3 million loan from the bank through a private acquisition before Daniel or Sophia ever know it changed hands. Once we hold that debt, we hold leverage no judge in this country could ignore, and we are going to preserve every scrap of the tea evidence chain of custody intact, so that when this goes to the authorities, it cannot be dismissed as a father's grudge. I authorized the purchase within the week. Gerald's firm negotiated directly with the bank's commercial lending division, framing it as a private debt restructuring, standard practice, nothing that would alert Daniel. Within 11 days, I quietly became the sole creditor holding my own son's fraudulent $2.3 million loan, secured against my own properties, without either him or Sophia having the faintest idea. There was one moment during that 11-day stretch that nearly unraveled the entire plan. Daniel called me on a Thursday evening, his voice unusually warm, inviting Margaret and me to a surprise dinner the following weekend to celebrate some exciting news. I asked carefully what the news was, and he laughed and said I would have to wait and see. I hung up the phone and immediately called Gerald, terrified that somehow he had learned the loan was being quietly acquired out from under him. Gerald calmed me down within minutes. If they knew Edward, you would not be getting an invitation to a celebration dinner. You would be getting a phone call from a very expensive attorney. He was right. The dinner, it turned out, was Daniel and Sophia announcing they had closed on a wonderful investment opportunity that would set the whole family up for generations. A vague, self-congratulatory toast over a $400 bottle of wine I recognized instantly as having been purchased with the very loan funds I now legally owned. I raised my glass with the rest of the table that night and said nothing. Margaret, sitting beside me in her wheelchair, squeezed my hand under the table, sensing something in my silence, but trusting me enough not to ask in front of company. That trust, that quiet, unshakable trust after 46 years of marriage, is the only thing that got me through that dinner without my hands shaking around my glass. At the same time Gerald's team was finalizing the loan acquisition, Marissa Boone was building the second half of our case. A retired detective with 18 years on the financial crimes unit before going private. Marissa did not simply take my word about the phone messages. She began, entirely within legal bounds, documenting a pattern of behavior that could stand independently in front of a judge. She interviewed, discreetly, 2 former co-workers of Sophia's, from a marketing firm she had been let go from 18 months earlier, both of whom described a woman who had, in their words, an obsession with appearing wealthier than she was, and who had once been formally warned by HR for using a company credit card for personal luxury purchases she later tried to disguise as client expenses. Marissa also tracked down the herbalist supplier Sophia had been ordering the tea ingredients from online, a small operation out of a strip mall 2 towns over that sold bulk dried botanicals with almost no oversight on dosage or interaction warnings. The owner, when Marissa visited under the pretense of researching a wellness article, admitted she had no formal training in herbalism, no license, and had simply been reselling ingredients she found on wholesale supplier websites, with printed warning labels she admitted she rarely read herself. This detail mattered enormously to Gerald, because it helped establish that whatever intent existed on Sophia's side, the tea itself was, at minimum, recklessly and dangerously assembled, and at worst, deliberately engineered, once combined with the specific compounds Dr. Whitfield had flagged as chemotherapy inhibitors. The tea alone might not get us a poisoning charge if a jury believes it was ignorance instead of intent, Gerald warned me over coffee one morning. But combined with the voice memo discussing timing, combined with the financial motive of an early inheritance, combined with the pattern Marissa is documenting, we are not looking at ignorance anymore. We are looking at a woman who researched exactly what would hurt Margaret and called it love while she did it. I did not sleep well during those weeks. I would lie awake next to Margaret, listening to her breathing, thinner and more labored than it used to be, and I would think about the 17 seconds of Sophia's voice, calmly discussing my wife's death, like a business projection, and I would have to physically stop myself from getting up, driving to Daniel's apartment, and putting my fist through his front door. What stopped me every single time was Margaret's own voice, years earlier, during a business dispute that had nearly ruined a partnership I valued, telling me, "Edward, the loudest man in the room, is rarely the one still standing at the end of it." I held on to that sentence like a rope during those sleepless nights. At the same time, I gave Dr. Whitfield's lab report and a certified copy of the withdrawn tea sample to a private investigator Gerald trusted, a retired detective named Marissa Boone, who quietly built a formal chain of evidence suitable for a criminal referral. She also, discreetly and legally, obtained a warrant-supported pull of the messages from Sophia's second phone, once we had enough independent corroborating evidence to establish probable cause, which meant everything I had seen with my own eyes that night would now exist in a form no defense attorney could throw out. Through all of this, I never once let my face change at the dinner table. I smiled at Sophia when she brought her tea. I thanked her for her devotion. I even wrote a check, in front of both of them, for an additional $60,000 toward wedding expenses, watching Sophia's eyes light up like a woman who believed she had already won. "You are too generous, Edward," she told me, hugging me at the door. "Truly, we don't deserve you." She had no idea how right she was. Margaret, weakened but stubborn, insisted on attending the wedding, despite everything her body was going through. Her hair had fallen out from the treatment months earlier. She wore a soft blue wig that Sophia herself had picked out for her, with great fanfare, claiming she wanted her future mother-in-law to feel beautiful on the big day. Margaret, ever gracious, ever trusting, thanked her with tears in her eyes. What Margaret did not know, what I chose not to burden her with until it was over, was what Sophia said behind her back during the final weeks of wedding planning. Marissa's investigation, cross-referenced with statements from 2 wedding vendors who had grown uneasy with what they witnessed, confirmed a pattern. At a dress fitting, Sophia had loudly complained to a bridesmaid that she couldn't believe she'd have to be photographed next to a woman in a wheelchair and a cheap wig. "It's going to ruin every picture." At the rehearsal dinner, she told her own mother, within earshot of a caterer, that Margaret was an embarrassment who should have just stayed home. Dying people shouldn't make everything about themselves. And Daniel, my son, the boy I raised to open doors for people, to stand up for the weak, sat there through every one of those comments, and said nothing. Not once, not a single word in his mother's defense. I recorded none of that firsthand. I did not need to. Marissa's report, the vendor statements, and later, security footage from the venue itself, would speak clearly enough for what happened on the day of the wedding. In the final month before the wedding, I watched Sophia's mask slip further and further, as if the closer she came to what she believed was the finish line, the less energy she felt she needed to spend pretending. At a menu tasting 3 weeks before the ceremony, she pulled Margaret's caretaker aside, a kind woman named Ruth, who had been helping Margaret with mobility and medication for the past several months, and told her, loud enough for me to overhear from the next table, "Just make sure she's not front and center in any of the family photos. I don't want the whole album looking like a hospital brochure." Ruth, to her credit, said nothing in response, but she told me about it privately in the parking lot afterward, her voice trembling with the kind of anger you feel on behalf of someone too gracious to be angry for themselves. At the final dress fitting, a bridesmaid named Claire, one of Sophia's college friends, later told Marissa during a follow-up interview that Sophia had complained openly in the fitting room, unaware or unconcerned that a seamstress was still present. "I can't believe I have to be photographed next to a woman in a wheelchair and a cheap wig," Claire recalled her saying. "It's going to ruin every single picture I actually care about." The seamstress, an older woman herself, later corroborated this account without hesitation when Marissa reached out, saying she remembered the comment specifically because it had made her so uncomfortable she had to step out of the room. At the rehearsal dinner, held at an upscale steakhouse 2 nights before the ceremony, Sophia's own mother made a comment that a caterer overheard and later repeated to Marissa during her canvassing of vendors. "Dying people shouldn't make everything about themselves," Sophia had apparently said to her mother, loud enough to carry over the clinking of glasses, referring directly to Margaret's decision to attend, despite her exhaustion from a treatment session earlier that same week. Daniel, seated beside her, said nothing. He did not defend his mother. He did not so much as flinch, according to the caterer, who described him as staring at his plate like a man trying very hard not to hear something. I was not present for any of these 3 specific moments, and I want to be honest about that, because honesty is the only thing I have left that I am certain still belongs entirely to me. I learned about them afterward, through Marissa's careful, corroborated, multiply-sourced investigation, the same kind of investigation I once used to root out a supplier who was quietly overbilling my company by pennies on every invoice, pennies that added up to millions over a decade. Small cruelties, left unchecked, always add up to something enormous. I had learned that lesson in business 30 years earlier. I was learning it again, far more painfully, inside my own family. What I was present for was the week leading up to the wedding, when Sophia doubled down on her performance of devotion, in front of me specifically. The way she must have calculated her father-in-law's approval could still be useful right up until the final hour. She brought Margaret a spa day gift certificate, just because. She insisted on personally styling Margaret's wig for the ceremony, spending nearly 2 hours at our kitchen table adjusting it, brushing it, telling Margaret how beautiful she looked, how lucky Daniel was to have a mother like her. Margaret, exhausted and starved for tenderness after months of illness, believed every word of it. I watched my wife's face soften with genuine gratitude, while the woman in front of her adjusted a wig she had already, according to everything Marissa had uncovered, begun planning to rip off in front of 300 people for a laugh she believed would cement her status as the fun, fearless bride nobody would dare cross. I said nothing during any of it. I smiled. I thanked Sophia for her kindness to my wife. I wrote that additional $60,000 check for wedding expenses exactly as planned, watching her eyes light up with the same greed I had first seen in that Instagram photo on the bow of the yacht. Every dollar I spent in those final weeks was not generosity. It was bait, carefully measured, designed to keep her confident, keep her comfortable, keep her certain that the old man writing checks had no idea what was coming for him. Gerald and Marissa finalized the last pieces of the case, exactly 6 days before the ceremony. The Financial Crimes Unit at the County Prosecutor's Office, after reviewing the forged signature, the toxicology report, the corroborated voice memo transcript, and the documented pattern of financial exploitation, agreed to coordinate an arrest at a location and time of our choosing, provided we gave them 48 hours notice to mobilize a team. I chose the wedding. Gerald tried, gently, to talk me out of it, worried it would look vindictive to a future jury, staged for maximum humiliation rather than justice. I told him I understood the risk, and I was willing to accept it, because Sophia had chosen to humiliate my wife in the most public way she could imagine, and I intended for justice to arrive, with exactly the same audience. The wedding took place at a grand ballroom downtown, 300 guests, string quartet, ice sculptures, the kind of excess I had quietly paid for without complaint, because I wanted this day, whatever else it might become, to be something Margaret could enjoy. I walked into that ballroom in a simple gray suit, my wife on my arm in her wheelchair, her blue wig neatly in place, her smile fragile but genuine. I remember the specific texture of that day, with a clarity that has not faded even now, more than a year later. The morning had been unseasonably warm, sunlight pouring through the tall windows of the bridal suite where Margaret got ready, Ruth helping her into a soft lavender dress we had chosen together specifically because it matched the ribbon on her wheelchair. Margaret had been nervous all morning, not about the wedding itself, but about whether she would have the stamina to make it through the reception without needing to leave early. "I don't want to embarrass Daniel," she told me quietly as I fixed my cufflinks in the mirror beside her. I remember biting back everything I already knew in that moment, every piece of evidence sitting in a locked drawer in Gerald's office, and simply telling her, "You could never embarrass anyone, Margaret. You never have." The ceremony itself was held in a glass-walled chapel adjoining the ballroom, sunlight streaming down the aisle, as Daniel stood at the altar in a dark navy suit, looking, for just a moment as Sophia walked toward him, like the boy I remembered teaching to tie a necktie for his 8th grade graduation. I let myself feel that memory fully, right up until the moment the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, because I knew what was coming, and I wanted, selfishly, one last untainted memory of my son before everything changed permanently. The ceremony went smoothly. It was during the reception, during the toasts, that everything I had built quietly for 3 months finally came due. Sophia stood at the microphone, radiant in white, and delivered a toast that made half the room tear up, thanking her new husband for believing in a bigger life, and thanking the family that made all of this possible. She spoke for nearly 4 minutes, weaving in a story about how Daniel had swept her off her feet during a chance meeting at a charity gala, how his family had welcomed her with open arms from the very first dinner, a claim that made me nearly choke on my water given everything sitting in that envelope in my jacket pocket. She thanked her own parents. She thanked her bridesmaids. Then, almost as an afterthought, she said, "And of course to Edward and Margaret, thank you for everything, truly, everything." And the emphasis she placed on that final word, sent a small, cold understanding through my chest, though I could not yet have told you why. The applause rose, glasses lifted, and, as it began to die down, Sophia set her champagne flute on the head table and walked, heels clicking against the marble floor, toward where Margaret sat in her wheelchair near the front. The room watched, expecting an embrace, a photo opportunity, a tender mother-daughter moment for the wedding album. Sophia leaned down, wrapped her arms around Margaret's shoulders, as if drawing her into a hug, and in one swift, practiced motion, pulled the wig clean off my wife's head in front of the entire ballroom. Margaret's bare scalp, pale and scarred from months of treatment, was exposed under the chandelier lights for 300 guests to see. There was a beat of stunned silence, and then, horrifyingly, laughter. Sophia's own bridesmaids, thinking it was some kind of joke, some kind of playful reveal, began to giggle. Someone near the bar let out a sharp bark of laughter before catching themselves. "Oops!" Sophia said into the microphone, feigning innocence, though the flash of satisfaction in her eyes told a different story entirely. "I guess wigs really aren't meant for dancing." I did not run. I did not shout. I walked, calm and deliberate, across that ballroom floor, took off my suit jacket, and gently draped it over my wife's bare head and shoulders, kissing her forehead as she trembled, tears streaming silently down her face. The room had gone completely suffocatingly quiet. Then I turned to Sophia. "I believe I still owe you your wedding gift," I said, my voice calm enough to carry across the entire ballroom without needing the microphone. I reached into my jacket, the one I had just taken off my own shoulders and placed on my wife, and pulled out a thick cream envelope, sealed, with Sophia and Daniel's names printed elegantly across the front. I had been carrying it all night. I walked it directly to her outstretched hand, the same hand that 30 seconds earlier had ripped the dignity off a dying woman's head, and I placed it gently into her palm. Her face lit up, that familiar greedy glow, certain this was a check, certain the old fool had finally paid up in full. She tore it open right there at the microphone, eager to show off whatever number was inside to the entire room. It was not a check. Inside was a formal notice of loan default on the $2.3 million commercial credit facility, now legally owned in full by Edward Collins Holdings, demanding immediate repayment within 10 business days. Behind it, copies of the forged collateral documents bearing my forged signature, flagged and certified by a document examiner. Behind that, the toxicology report on the tea, sealed with Dr. Whitfield's laboratory letterhead. And on top of all of it, a single sheet from the Ohio Attorney General's office. A formal notice that a criminal referral had been filed regarding elder abuse, fraud, and attempted poisoning. Sophia's face went from confusion to horror in the span of 3 seconds. The color drained from her cheeks so fast I genuinely thought she might faint at the microphone. At that exact moment, right on schedule, right as Marissa and I had arranged with the local financial crimes unit 2 days prior, the ballroom's rear doors opened. 4 plainclothes detectives and 2 uniformed officers walked in, badges raised, moving purposefully toward the head table. A stunned murmur rippled through 300 wedding guests, as glasses lowered and phones came up to film what was suddenly unfolding. "Sophia Reyes, Daniel Collins," one of the detectives said, his voice cutting cleanly through the string quartet that had gone silent mid-note. "We need you both to come with us. There's an active investigation regarding financial fraud, forged banking documents, and elder endangerment that we need to discuss." Daniel stood so fast his chair toppled backward, the crystal centerpiece on the table wobbling and nearly shattering against the floor. "This is insane. This is my wedding. You can't do this here," he stammered, looking wildly at me, then at Sophia, then back at the detectives approaching with unhurried, professional calm. "Dad, what did you do? What is this?" "I didn't do anything to you, son," I said quietly, loud enough only for him to hear over the murmur rippling through the crowd. "I just stopped protecting you from what you did to yourself." Sophia, still holding my wife's wig in one trembling hand, looked down at the envelope's contents scattered across the head table, where she had dropped them, the toxicology report face up beside the forged loan documents, and something in her composure finally, completely broke. "This is a mistake," she said, her voice climbing into a register I had never heard from her before, high and thin, and genuinely afraid. "I don't know what any of this is. I never touched that loan. This is insane. Daniel, tell them Tell them this is insane." Daniel did not tell them anything. He stood frozen beside his overturned chair, staring at the documents on the table, and I watched something shift behind his eyes. The specific and terrible moment a person realizes the story they have been telling themselves for months is no longer sustainable in front of witnesses. One of the detectives stepped forward with a pair of handcuffs, reciting Sophia's rights in the same flat, practiced tone I imagine he used 100 times before. While 300 wedding guests sat frozen at their tables, phones raised, string quartets silent, ice sculptures slowly beginning to weep onto white tablecloths in the warm ballroom air. Within the hour, both their personal accounts and the joint account holding what remained of the yacht money had been frozen under an emergency asset preservation order Gerald had filed that same morning. The yacht itself, still docked at Meridian, was seized as part of the fraud investigation 2 days later. The lakefront property they had put a deposit on was voided in the underlying contract once the funding source was flagged as fraudulent. Within a month, the $2.3 million commercial loan I now owned outright gave me full legal standing to force liquidation of nearly every asset they had acquired during their scheme, including the boat, a leased luxury car in Sophia's name, and jewelry purchased with the stolen loan funds. They were led out of that ballroom in handcuffs in front of every single guest who had just watched Sophia rip a wig off a cancer patient's head 20 minutes earlier. Nobody was laughing anymore. I remember the sound of that ballroom in the seconds after the officers walked Daniel and Sophia out through the same doors the wedding party had entered through, only hours earlier. Triumphant, laughing, certain of a future that had just been dismantled in front of everyone they had invited to witness their happiness. It was the sound of 300 people realizing, all at once, that the story they thought they were watching had been a different story the entire time. Somewhere near the back of the room, I heard someone quietly say, "Oh my God, that's Edward Collins, from Collins Freight." And I understood then that some of the guests, business associates of mine from decades past, finally recognized whose party they had actually been standing in. The days immediately following the wedding were a blur of phone calls, legal filings, and reporters. A local business journal picked up the story within 72 hours, running a piece under the headline, "Ohio Businessman Uncovers Family Fraud Scheme. Arrests Made at Own Son's Wedding." I did not give a single interview. Gerald handled every media request with a short, careful statement. Mr. Collins's only concern throughout this matter has been the health and dignity of his wife. He asks for privacy for his family during this difficult time. Privacy, of course, was the one thing that story would never fully get back. But I did not do any of this for headlines. I did it because a jury of 300 wedding guests had already rendered their own verdict the moment the laughter in that ballroom died in their throats. The criminal proceedings took nearly 9 months to resolve. Daniel's attorney, a competent but clearly overmatched young associate from a mid-sized firm, approached the county prosecutor within the first 6 weeks, seeking a plea arrangement. Facing charges of bank fraud, forgery of financial instruments, and conspiracy, with the forged signature evidence alone carrying a potential decade in federal prison, Daniel agreed to plead guilty to reduced charges of fraud and forgery in exchange for a 5-year sentence, suspended to 18 months served plus 5 years of supervised probation, restitution of the full $2.3 million loan amount payable directly to me as the loan's rightful holder, and, critically, his full cooperation and testimony against Sophia in her separate proceedings. I sat in the courtroom the day Daniel entered his plea. He did not look at me during the hearing, not once, keeping his eyes fixed on the defense table in front of him. His shoulders hunched in a way I had never seen on my son before, a posture that made him look, for the first time in his adult life, genuinely small. When the judge asked him directly whether he understood the charges against him, his voice cracked on the word, "yes," and something in my chest cracked along with it, despite everything. Despite the forged signature, despite the tea, despite the silence at that rehearsal dinner, while his own mother was insulted. He is still my son. That fact did not disappear the day I learned what he had done. It simply stopped being the only fact that mattered. Outside the courthouse that afternoon, Daniel's attorney asked me, almost gently, if I wanted a moment with my son before he was transported. I said yes before I had fully decided whether it was the right thing to do. We stood in a small side hallway, a deputy a respectful distance away, and Daniel finally looked at me directly for the first time since the wedding. "Dad," he said, his voice thin, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just need you to know, I never wanted Mom to get hurt. I told myself the tea thing wasn't real, that Sophia was exaggerating on the phone, that it was just talk. I studied my son's face for a long moment, searching for the boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during Sunday drives, and I told him the only thing I had left to give him in that hallway. Talk is never just talk, when it's about someone's life, Daniel. You knew that. You've always known that. I did not hug him. I did not shake his hand. I simply nodded, once, and walked back out into the daylight, leaving my son standing in that hallway, with a deputy, and the weight of everything he had chosen. Sophia's case moved differently, and far less mercifully, because unlike Daniel, she refused every plea offered to her, insisting through 2 different defense attorneys that the tea was a cultural family recipe passed down from her grandmother, that any interaction with Margaret's chemotherapy was purely coincidental and unknown to her, and that the voice memo recovered from her phone had been taken out of context. The prosecution built its case methodically over the following months, anchored by Dr. Whitfield's toxicology report, corroborated by a second independent lab the prosecutor's office commissioned to eliminate any doubt about contamination or tampering, supported by Marissa's documented pattern of financial motive and premeditation, and ultimately strengthened enormously by Daniel's own cooperating testimony, in which he confirmed, under oath, that Sophia had discussed with him on multiple occasions how an accelerated inheritance would solve their mounting financial pressures. The trial itself lasted 11 days, held in a modest courtroom downtown, with wood paneling that reminded me, oddly, of my father's old barn. I testified on the 4th day, describing the yacht wire transfer, the forged loan documents, and the moment I found the second phone. The defense attorney, a sharp woman who clearly understood her client's position was difficult, tried repeatedly to paint me as a vindictive father, orchestrating a public humiliation for a woman who had simply made an innocent mistake with an herbal recipe. "Isn't it true, Mr. Collins," she asked me during cross-examination, "that you deliberately chose to expose this at your own son's wedding, in front of hundreds of guests, specifically to maximize the damage to my client's reputation?" I did not look away from her. "I chose the wedding," I told her, "because that was the day my daughter-in-law chose to humiliate my dying wife in front of the same 300 people. I simply made sure the truth arrived at the same party the cruelty did." Gerald told me afterward that he watched 2 jurors nod, almost imperceptibly, when I said it. I did not look at Sophia while I spoke. I looked at the jury, the way Gerald had coached me to, and I told the truth as plainly and calmly as I could manage, because I had learned by then that the calmest version of the truth is always the most devastating one. Dr. Whitfield testified on the 5th day, walking the jury through the specific compounds found in the tea and their documented interaction with Margaret's chemotherapy regimen, using charts and slow, patient language that left very little room for doubt. The defense's own expert witness, hired to challenge the toxicology findings, ultimately conceded under cross-examination that the compound levels found were inconsistent with casual, accidental preparation, a phrase Gerald later told me was likely the single most damaging sentence spoken during the entire trial, coming as it did from the defense's own hired expert. Margaret testified on the 6th day, wheeled to the witness stand by Ruth, her voice steady, despite everything her body had endured over the previous 14 months. She described the tea, the daily ritual of it, the way Sophia insisted on brewing it herself, refusing help, refusing substitutions, always so careful, always so attentive. She described the wig, the 2 hours Sophia spent adjusting it at our kitchen table days before the wedding, telling her how beautiful she looked. And then, her voice finally beginning to waver for the first time in the entire trial, she described what it felt like to sit in front of 300 people with her bare scalp exposed under a chandelier, while people she had trusted, people she had welcomed into her family, with an open heart, despite everything cancer had already taken from her, laughed at what remained of her hair. There was not a dry eye in that jury box by the time she finished, and I watched, from my seat behind the prosecution table, as even the bailiff standing near the door quietly wiped at his own face with the back of his hand. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours before returning to the courtroom, and I remember the specific quality of that silence. While we waited outside in the hallway, Gerald pacing slowly by the vending machines, Margaret sitting perfectly still with her hands folded in her lap. Both of us afraid to say anything out loud that might somehow jinx a verdict we had waited 9 months to hear. When the bailiff finally called us back in, my legs felt heavier than they had in years, walking down that aisle to our seats. Sophia was convicted on all 4 counts: financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, forgery as an accessory, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted poisoning by administration of a harmful substance, the last charge carrying the most weight in sentencing. She was sentenced to 11 years in state prison, with a mandatory minimum of 7 years before any eligibility for parole. When the verdict was read, she did not cry. She stared straight ahead, the same cold composure I remembered from the night she brewed that tea in my kitchen with such theatrical tenderness. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I finally understood that I had not been looking at a woman who loved my son and lost her way. I had been looking, the entire time, at exactly who she always was. Margaret finished her chemotherapy 8 months after the wedding. Her scans came back clear this past spring, a full remission her oncologist described as remarkable, though he was careful to note, gently, that removing whatever had been interfering with her treatment likely played no small part in that recovery. Margaret wears her wig now not out of shame, but because she says it reminds her of the day her husband stood in front of 300 people and chose her over his own blood, without raising his voice, without breaking a single dish, without giving anyone in that ballroom the satisfaction of watching him lose control. Daniel served 14 months of his sentence before being released to a halfway house, where he currently lives while working a warehouse job to begin paying down the restitution owed on the loan I still legally hold. He has written to me 11 times since his release. Long letters handwritten, apologizing not just for the money, not just for the forged signature, but for the 11 seconds of silence at that rehearsal dinner, when his own mother was mocked and he said nothing. I have answered 3 of those letters so far. I am not ready to answer the rest. Margaret tells me forgiveness is not a debt with a due date, and I am trying, slowly, to believe her. We bought that house near the hospital finally, 5 months after the wedding, using funds I had set aside separately the entire time, never touched by the scheme, never at risk. It is a modest single-story home with wide doorways and a covered porch, exactly like the one Daniel showed me in those photographs so long ago. Except this one is real, paid for in full, sitting in both our names on a deed no one forged. Margaret sits on that porch every afternoon now, sun on her face, watching the birds at the feeder I built for her with my own hands the week we moved in. And some evenings, when the light gets long and gold across the yard, she reaches over and takes my hand without saying anything at all. And I understand exactly what that silence means, because after 46 years, I have learned to hear everything my wife does not need to say out loud. People ask me sometimes if I regret waiting so long to act, if I regret smiling at Sophia while she poisoned my wife's tea and forged my signature on federal loan documents. I tell them the same thing every time. Anger gives you a moment of satisfaction. Patience gives you justice. My granddaughter, Daniel's daughter from an earlier relationship, a bright 14-year-old named Ava who has lived with us on and off since the whole ordeal began, asked me once, not long after the trial ended, why I never yelled at her father, not once, not even when I found the voice memo, not even standing in that ballroom with my wife's bare scalp exposed under the chandelier lights. I thought about that question for a long time before I answered her, because I owed her an honest answer, not a simple one. I told her that yelling is what men do when they want the world to know they are hurting. Silence, real silence, the kind I practiced for those 3 months, is what men do when they have already decided to do something about it. I told her that her grandmother taught me, all the way back at that diner outside of Columbus, 46 years ago, that the people who talk the loudest about what they deserve are rarely the ones who end up earning it. And that lesson has never once failed me in 4 decades of business or in the hardest year of my life. Ava has grown into a remarkable young woman since then, careful with her words, quick with her mind. And I like to believe some small part of that comes from watching her grandfather choose patience over rage, during the worst months our family ever lived through. Margaret and I still garden together most mornings before the heat sets in, her in her sun hat, me kneeling in the dirt beside the tomatoes she insists on planting every single spring, regardless of what her doctors say about overexertion. We do not talk about Sophia much anymore. We do not talk about the ballroom, or the wig, or the tea, though I know Margaret still touches the back of her head sometimes. An unconscious gesture, when she is deep in thought, a small physical echo of a wound that has healed on the surface, but will likely never fully leave either of us. What we do talk about is the future. The modest one we always wanted. Sunlight on a covered porch. Birds at a feeder. The quiet certainty of a life we built honestly, together, over 46 years. That no amount of greed from anyone, blood relative or not, was ever going to be allowed to take from us. I am 72 years old, and I have finally learned that the strongest thing a quiet man can do is wait until the world underestimates him completely, and then close the door behind them, so gently, they don't even hear the lock click until it's already too late. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I think back to that Tuesday morning, 6 days after Margaret's diagnosis worsened, when I sat at my kitchen table and told Daniel I wanted to buy a house near the hospital. I think about how simple that moment was, how full of hope, how completely unaware I was of everything it would eventually cost us to protect. I do not regret that decision. I do not regret trusting my son with something that mattered, even though that trust was the very door greed walked through. What I have come to understand, at 72 years old, sitting on a porch I built with my own hands beside the woman I have loved for 46 years, is that love without vigilance is simply an invitation, and vigilance without love is simply cruelty. And the only thing that ever actually protects a family is both of those things held together, quietly, patiently, for as long as it takes. If this story moved you even a little, please hit like, subscribe to Humble Dad Stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. There are more stories like this one coming, and I promise you, every single one of them ends the same way. Quietly, completely, justly.